Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. In the autumn of 1553, the most powerful man on earth, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, made a decision that would stain his golden legacy forever. He summoned his eldest son, the beloved and brilliant Prince Mustafa, to his war camp. It was not for a council of war, but for a death sentence. Was this the cold calculus of a ruler eliminating a threat, or the tragic downfall of a father manipulated by palace intrigue and his own deepest fears? This is the story of how a sultan, at the zenith of his power, destroyed his own future. In the gilded heart of the Topkapi Palace, during the incandescent dawn of the Ottoman Empire's greatest age, a prince was born. He was Şehzade Mustafa, the firstborn son of the young Sultan Suleiman. Born in 1515, he was the embodiment of a dynasty's hope, the living promise of a magnificent future. His mother, Mahidevran, was the rose of the harem, and in her son, she saw the continuation of a glorious line. From his earliest days, Mustafa was groomed not just for power, but for greatness. He was tutored by the sharpest minds in the empire, learning theology, literature, history, and the intricate art of governance. But it was in the martial disciplines that he truly excelled. He was a natural horseman, a gifted archer, and a swordsman of prodigious skill. He possessed a charisma that drew people to him, a gravitas that belied his youth. His father, Suleiman, the lawgiver, the magnificent, saw in his son a reflection of his own youthful ambition and strength. In the early years, the bond between them was the bedrock of the empire's future. The Sultan paraded his heir before the court and the army, a symbol of stability and power. The Janissaries, the elite fighting force of the empire, looked upon the young prince with reverence. They saw in his eyes the fire of his great-grandfather, Selim the Grim, and the wisdom of his father. He was their future sultan, the warrior prince who would lead them to new conquests and unprecedented glory. In the sprawling gardens of the palace, amidst the scent of tulips and jasmine, Mustafa was more than just a boy. He was a living ideal. He was the golden prince, the undisputed heir, the sun around which the imperial court revolved. There was no doubt, no shadow of a rival. The path to the throne was clear, paved with the expectations of an entire empire. His destiny seemed as certain as the rising of the sun over the Bosphorus. Within the silent, perfumed corridors of the Imperial Harem, power was a currency as vital as gold, and a son was the ultimate treasure. For Mahidevran Sultan, her son Mustafa was her entire world, her claim to status, and her shield against the transient nature of a sultan's favor. Known as Gulbahar, the rose of spring, her beauty had once captivated Suleiman, and the birth of his first son had elevated her to the highest rank a concubine could achieve. She was the mother of the heir apparent, the future Valida Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. Her life was a tapestry woven with threads of pride and fierce, protective love. She instilled in Mustafa the values of a prince: honor, duty, and an unshakable sense of his own destiny. Every public appearance, every word of praise from the Sultan, every cheer from the soldiers for her son, solidified her position and her hope. But the harem was a world of whispers and shifting allegiances. It was a beautiful cage where hope and fear were constant companions. Mahidevran, for all her status, understood the precariousness of her position. A sultan's heart was a vast and unpredictable territory. Her favor, and by extension her son's security, depended entirely on maintaining that affection. The fear was a quiet, creeping thing. It was the fear of a new face, a new favorite who might capture the sultan's imagination. It was the terror that another woman might also bear a son, creating a rival to her perfect golden prince. In the Ottoman tradition of fratricide, where a new sultan often eliminated his brothers to secure the throne, a rival prince was not merely a competitor. He was a potential death sentence for her own child. Mahidevran's hope was therefore absolute and desperate. She guarded Mustafa not just as a mother guards a child, but as a queen guards her entire kingdom, for in his survival lay her own. The slightest cooling in Suleiman's gaze, the briefest whisper of a new woman in his chambers, was enough to ignite a terror that would soon prove to be prophetic. The storm that would shatter Mahidevran's world and rewrite the destiny of the Ottoman Empire arrived not as an army, but as a single, unassuming slave girl from the plains of Ruthenia. Captured by raiders, she was brought to the Topkapi slave market, a place where lives were bought and sold. But this was no ordinary woman. Her name was Alexandra Lisovska, but the world would come to know her as Hurrem, the cheerful one. With her fiery red hair and laughter that could charm the Sultan himself, she was unlike anyone the court had ever seen. She was not merely beautiful, she was possessed of a formidable intelligence and an unbreakable will. Hurrem did not play by the established rules of the harem. She rewrote them. She captured more than Suleiman's attention. She captured his heart and his mind, becoming his confidant, his advisor, and his obsession. In a move that scandalized the court and broke centuries of tradition, Suleiman freed her from slavery and made her his legal wife. The power dynamic of the empire was irrevocably altered. Hurrem Sultan was no longer just a favorite. She was the Haseki Sultan, a new title created just for her, wielding unprecedented influence. And then she began to bear sons: Mehmed, Abdullah, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir. Each birth was a blow to Mahidevran and a direct threat to Mustafa's future. The harem was no longer a realm of one heir, but a battleground of competing bloodlines. Hurrem's ambition was limitless, fueled by a fierce love for her own children and a survivor's instinct to eliminate any threat. She understood that as long as Mustafa, the popular and capable firstborn, lived, her own sons would never be safe upon Suleiman's death. She began to cast a long shadow over the court, a web of political intrigue and carefully chosen words whispered into the Sultan's ear. She allied herself with powerful figures like the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, who would become her son-in-law. The Golden Prince Mustafa was no longer the undisputed heir. He was now an obstacle. As tradition dictated, a prince's education was completed not in the palace, but in the crucible of governance. In 1533, Şehzade Mustafa was appointed governor of Manisa, the traditional sanjak, or province, for the heir apparent. This was his moment to prove his readiness to rule, and he did not disappoint. In Manisa, Mustafa blossomed from a prince into a statesman. He governed with a wisdom and justice that earned him the adoration of his subjects. He patronized poets and scholars, turning his court into a center of culture. He listened to the grievances of the common people and commanded the respect of the local military garrisons. But it was his connection with the Janissaries that truly defined his time in Manisa. When he accompanied his father on campaigns, he fought with courage and skill, endearing himself to the soldiers who saw him as the ideal warrior sultan. They saw in him a leader who understood them, who bled with them, and who embodied the martial spirit of the empire. Letters and poems praising him flowed from the provinces to the capital. He was hailed as the future of the dynasty, the true heir to Suleiman's greatness. The people loved him, the army revered him, and in this immense popularity, the seeds of his destruction found fertile ground. Every cheer for Mustafa in Manisa was heard in Istanbul as a challenge. Every soldier who swore loyalty to the prince was perceived as one less loyal to the Sultan. To Hurrem Sultan and her allies, Mustafa's success was not a testament to his ability, but a dangerous accumulation of power. They began to frame his popularity as ambition, his competence as a threat. Whispers reached Suleiman that the Janissaries wanted Mustafa on the throne now, that the prince was growing impatient. His virtues were methodically twisted into vices. His strength was portrayed as defiance. The people's champion of Manisa was becoming, in the eyes of his increasingly wary father, a rival power center, a potential usurper who commanded an army that might one day march on the capital. While whispers and plots fermented in the gilded corridors of Topkapi, Prince Mustafa was forging his destiny in steel and loyalty. As governor of Manisa and later Amasya, he was not merely a princeling playing at administration. He was the living embodiment of the Ghazi spirit, the warrior prince ideal that had birthed the empire. His first true test came not in the council chambers, but on the eastern frontier, a perennial crucible for Ottoman ambition. In the campaigns against the Safavid Empire, Mustafa proved he was more than just Suleiman's son. He was a commander in his own right. He rode at the head of his men, not from a gilded litter in the rear. He shared their rations, slept under the same unforgiving sky, and bled with them. The Janissaries, the hardened slave soldiers of the Sultan, saw in him a reflection of the great warrior sultans of the past. They saw a leader who understood their language, the language of the sword. His personal charisma was magnetic. He learned the names of his commanders, remembered the deeds of common soldiers, and dispensed justice with a firm but even hand. His court in Amasya became a magnet for poets, scholars, and warriors who felt alienated by the increasingly bureaucratic and intrigue-laden court in Istanbul. They saw Mustafa as the true heir, the guardian of Ottoman tradition. His popularity became legendary, a song sung by soldiers on the march and a prayer whispered by common folk who saw him as their protector. But every victory he won, every cheer he received from the Janissaries, was a double-edged sword. In Istanbul, these reports of his triumphs were not received with unalloyed pride. They were twisted, reinterpreted as evidence of a dangerous ambition, of a son building a power base to challenge his own father. The very qualities that made him the perfect heir were the same qualities that would mark him for death. The heart of the Ottoman Empire was not the battlefield where Mustafa thrived, but the divan, the Imperial Council, a viper's nest of ambition masked by velvet robes and obsequious titles. And in this arena, a new power was rising, a man whose weapon was not the scimitar, but the poisoned word, Rustem Pasha. A man of humble Croatian origin, brought to the palace through the Devshirme system, Rustem possessed a formidable intelligence and a complete absence of scruples. His ascent was calculated, culminating in the ultimate political maneuver. His marriage to Mahidevran Sultan, the cherished and only daughter of Suleiman and Hürrem Sultan. This union made him not just the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire, but a son-in-law to the Sultan, the Damat. He was now family. More importantly, he became the indispensable instrument of his mother-in-law, Hürrem. Their interests were perfectly aligned. For Hürrem's sons to have any chance at the throne, Mustafa, the beloved firstborn, had to be removed. As Grand Vizier, Rustem controlled the flow of information to the Sultan. He was the gatekeeper of the empire's secrets and its official narrative. Every report from the provinces passed through his hands. Mustafa's military successes were framed as acts of insubordination. His generosity to his soldiers was painted as bribery to win their loyalty for a future rebellion. His correspondence with foreign dignitaries, a normal duty for a prince governing a border province, was presented as clandestine negotiation with the empire's enemies. The whispers began subtly, a concerned observation here, a feigned warning there. Rustem and his allies would sow doubt in the minds of other pashas, who, fearing for their own positions, would echo these concerns to the Sultan. The Divan, once a council of state, became an echo chamber for slander, slowly and methodically eroding the foundation of trust between a father and his most brilliant son. Whispers and slander could poison a relationship, but to condemn the heir apparent to death required something more tangible, something that looked like irrefutable proof of treason. The final, masterfully cruel stroke of the conspiracy against Mustafa was a masterwork of political forgery. The target was perfect: Shah Tahmasp of the rival Safavid Empire in Persia. The two empires were locked in a decades-long struggle, a bitter ideological and military conflict. Any communication with the Shah was tantamount to consorting with the devil himself. The plan, executed under the careful supervision of Rustem Pasha, was to create a correspondence that never existed. Skilled calligraphers, masters of imitation, were employed to replicate Prince Mustafa's handwriting and official seal. They drafted letters, supposedly from Mustafa to the Shah, filled with treasonous propositions. The letters spoke of an alliance, of Mustafa's frustration with his aging father's rule, and hinted at a plan to seize the Ottoman throne with Safavid support. In return for this aid, the letters promised territorial concessions, a betrayal of everything the empire stood for. To complete the deception, a reply was also forged, seemingly from Shah Tahmasp, encouraging Mustafa's ambitions and addressing him as the future sultan. The final piece was Mustafa's own seal. It is believed that one of his most trusted officials, a man secretly in Rustam's pay, stole the seal, pressed it onto the forged documents, and then returned it, leaving the prince completely unaware. Armed with this damning evidence, Rustam Pasha sought his audience with Suleiman. He presented the letters not as rumor, but as captured intelligence, a conspiracy uncovered at the final hour. For the Sultan, already primed by years of insinuation and doubt, the sight of his son's seal on a letter to his mortal enemy was the ultimate betrayal. The web was complete. The forgeries were not just ink on paper, they were a death warrant. To understand why Suleiman, the lawgiver, a man of profound intellect and piety, could believe this deception, we must look beyond the forged letters. We must look into the Sultan's own soul, to a ghost that haunted the house of Osman. This was the ghost of his own father, Selim the Grim. Suleiman had not inherited his throne peacefully. He had watched as his father, Selim, a fearsome and ambitious prince, rose up against his own father, Sultan Bayezid II. Backed by the Janissaries who adored his warrior spirit, Selim had forced the old sultan from his throne and into a fatal exile. Selim then secured his rule in the traditional, brutal Ottoman way, by executing his brothers and nephews, eliminating all rival claimants in a sea of blood. This was the foundation of Suleiman's power, a throne seized through patricide and fratricide. This history was not a dusty footnote. It was a living, breathing nightmare in Suleiman's mind. And in Mustafa, he saw a terrifying reflection of his own father. Mustafa was immensely popular with the army, especially the Janissaries, the very same kingmakers who had propelled Selim to power. Mustafa was a brilliant commander, charismatic, and stationed in the east, perfectly positioned to march on the capital if he chose. The whispers from Rustam and the forged letters from the Shah were not the true cause of Suleiman's decision. They were merely the key that unlocked his deepest, most primal fear. The fear of history repeating itself. The fear that he, like his grandfather Bayezid, would be seen as old and weak and be cast aside by a vigorous, beloved son. He was trapped in a tragic paradox. The law of fratricide, which demanded a new sultan kill his brothers to prevent civil war, was designed to protect the empire. Now, Suleiman believed he had to extend that logic, to preemptively strike down his own son to avert the same fate. It was a choice between his son and his empire, between paternal love and the terrifying ghost of his father's sin. By 1553, the gears of the vast Ottoman war machine were grinding into motion once more. The target was the perennial enemy to the east, the Safavid Empire of Persia. For Sultan Suleiman, now in his late 50s, this was more than a campaign. It was a matter of legacy and imperial security. But this war would not be fought only in the rugged mountains of Anatolia and the arid plains of Persia. A second, more insidious war was being waged in the shadows of the court, in whispered conversations and sealed letters. The commander of the Eastern Army, the vanguard against the Safavid Shah Tahmasp, was Şehzade Mustafa. And in this, his greatest military opportunity, lay the seeds of his destruction. In the field, Mustafa was everything the empire could desire. He was adored by the soldiers, especially the elite Janissaries, who saw in him the martial spirit of their greatest sultans. He was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader who inspired fierce loyalty. He was, in every way, his father's son. And that was precisely the problem. Back in the capital, Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha and Hurrem Sultan watched this rising sun with cold dread. Every victory Mustafa won, every cheer he received from the troops, was twisted into a threat. They painted a picture for the aging sultan, a son whose popularity had eclipsed his own, a prince who commanded an army that was more loyal to him than to the Padishah. The Persian campaign became their stage. As Mustafa prepared for war, letters began to circulate. Some were allegedly from Shah Tahmasp himself, addressed to Mustafa, speaking to him as an equal, a future ruler. Were they genuine, clever forgeries? It no longer mattered. They were presented to Suleiman as undeniable proof of treason. The Shah, a master of psychological warfare, was likely all too happy to fan the flames of discord within the Ottoman dynasty. For Suleiman, the war now had two fronts. One was against the Safavids for control of the borderlands. The other, far more terrifying, was for control of his own empire against the son he had once cherished above all others. In his imperial tent, surrounded by maps of Persia and reports from the front, Suleiman the lawgiver faced a crisis that no code of law could resolve. The evidence laid before him by Rustam Pasha was damning. Forged or not, the letters implied a secret correspondence with the enemy. The reports, laced with poison, spoke of Janissaries chanting Mustafa's name, calling for the old sultan to step aside and let the young lion rule. For Suleiman, this was not merely a family drama. It was an existential threat to the principle of Nizam al-Alam, the world order, which he was divinely appointed to protect. The history of his own dynasty was a bloody testament to the chaos of contested succession. He remembered the fratricidal war between his grandfather Bayezid II and his uncle Cem, a conflict that had weakened the empire for decades and invited foreign interference. He knew that a civil war between Mustafa and his other sons, backed by their powerful mothers and court factions, would tear the realm asunder. The choice before him was unbearable, a crucible for the soul of a man who was both a father and an emperor. On one side was the love for his firstborn, the brilliant, handsome prince who embodied the Ottoman ideal. He had watched Mustafa grow, had trained him, had seen the reflection of his own youthful ambition in his son's eyes. On the other side was the crushing weight of the crown. The Sultan was not a man, he was an institution. His personal feelings were a luxury the empire could not afford. The whispers of Hurrem and Rustem preyed on his deepest fears, that he was losing control, that his age was making him weak, and that the son he loved was poised to usurp him, plunging the world into darkness. In the lonely silence of his chambers, the father had to die so the Sultan could live. He had to sacrifice the part to save the whole. The decision was made not in a fit of rage, but in the cold, calculated calculus of absolute power. The order had to be given. Mustafa had to be eliminated. The air in the Sultan's campaign headquarters near Ereğli was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the impending battle against the Safavids. The decision had been made. Now, the trap had to be set. A royal summons was drafted, a masterpiece of cold, imperial ambiguity. It was not an accusation, but an invitation. Şehzade Mustafa was ordered to present himself at his father's camp to discuss the next phase of the campaign. It was a father calling his son to his side, a commander summoning his general. But to those who knew the court's deadly currents, the words carried a chilling undertone. The messenger rode from the Sultan's camp toward Amasya, carrying the fate of the heir apparent in a leather satchel. As the news of the summons reached Mustafa's camp, a wave of apprehension spread through his inner circle. His loyal advisors, men like the poet Tashlachela Yahya, saw the snare immediately. They pleaded with him not to go. To disobey the Sultan was an act of open rebellion, but to obey was to walk willingly into the executioner's grasp. They urged him to consider the evidence, Rustam Pasha's open hostility, the slanders that had been circulating for years, the sudden and unusual nature of the summons to a campaign already underway. Mustafa was now faced with his own impossible choice. To refuse the summons would be to give his enemies the very proof they needed. It would validate every lie, confirm every suspicion of treason, and brand him a rebel in the eyes of the world and of the father he still loved and respected. He was caught in a perfect paradox. His innocence was his death warrant. Believing in his own integrity, and perhaps clinging to a desperate hope that he could reason with his father and expose the conspiracy against him, Mustafa made his decision. He would obey. He would ride to his father's camp and face his destiny, whatever it might be. He would show the world, and his sultan, that he was a loyal son, not a traitor. It was an honorable choice, a prince's choice, and it would be his last. The journey from Amasya to the sultan's camp in the Konya Valley was not a march of triumph, but a somber procession. Şehzade Mustafa rode at the head of a small, loyal retinue, the autumn wind of the Anatolian plateau whipping at his standards. The usual cheers from villagers and townsfolk that had always accompanied his movements were now more subdued, tinged with a sense of foreboding. Everyone knew the stakes. This was not a son going to meet his father. It was a potential future meeting, a precarious present. As they drew closer, the sheer scale of the imperial camp became visible, a city of tents sprawling across the plain, thousands of soldiers, a sea of disciplined power. But for Mustafa, it must have felt less like the heart of his empire and more like the end of the world. His advisors made one last, desperate plea. They begged him to take a larger guard, to enter the camp armed and ready. But Mustafa refused. To arrive with an army would be an admission of guilt. His only defense was his absolute, unshakable innocence. He would approach his father as a son, not as a rival. Upon reaching the perimeter of the vast encampment, he was met by the Sultan's chamberlains. The protocol was strict and unnerving. He was asked to disarm. His sword, his dagger, the very symbols of his princely status and martial prowess, were taken from him. He complied without protest, a symbolic act of total submission. He was trusting his life to his father's justice. He walked through the rows of silent, watching Janissaries, men who had followed him into battle, who loved him, but who were now powerless, bound by their ultimate loyalty to the reigning sultan. He arrived before the magnificent imperial tent, a structure of awe-inspiring grandeur. The flaps were closed. Inside, his father waited, and with him, the deaf-mute executioners, the dilses, the silent servants of the sultan's final unappealable will. Taking a deep breath, Şehzade Mustafa, the hope of the empire, stepped across the threshold into darkness. The year is 1553. The vast plains of Ereğli, near Konya, are transformed into a sprawling metropolis of canvas and steel. This is the staging ground for Sultan Suleiman's third campaign against the Safavid Empire, a formidable gathering of the Ottoman war machine. Yet, the true enemy is not the Persian Shah. The true conflict lies within the heart of the Sultan himself. For weeks, whispers had slithered through the camp like desert snakes, tales of treason carried on the wind. Letters, expertly forged or tragically real, spoke of a secret correspondence between the heir, Şehzade Mustafa, and the Safavid Shah. They claimed Mustafa, beloved by the army, was plotting to usurp his aging father's throne. Suleiman, a man now in his late 50s, his spirit burdened by decades of rule and the incessant machinations of his court, had finally been convinced. He summoned his son to the front. Mustafa, governing his province, received the summons not with fear, but with a sense of duty. His advisors begged him not to go, pleading that it was a trap laid by his stepmother, Hürrem Sultan, and her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha. But Mustafa's honor, his very essence, was rooted in his loyalty to his father and the state. To refuse the summons would be an admission of guilt. He rode into the camp not as a traitor, but as a commander, the soldiers cheering his name, his presence a beacon of strength. He saw the Janissaries' adoration as a sign of his destiny, never imagining it was the very fuel for his father's paranoia. He made his way to the imperial complex at the center of the camp. There, a single, vast, white tent stood apart from the rest. It was the Sultan's audience tent, the heart of the empire. As protocol demanded, Mustafa handed over his weapons, his dagger and his sword, before entering. It was a gesture of respect. Today, it was a gesture of surrender, He was now defenseless, walking into the silent, waiting jaws of judgment. Mustafa parted the heavy flaps of the tent and stepped inside. The immediate silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the bustling camp outside. The air was thick with the scent of incense and dread. The tent was opulent, lined with priceless silks and carpets, but it was empty. There were no viziers, no guards, no father waiting to greet him. There was only a screen of intricate latticework dividing the space. Behind it, a shadow moved. It was Suleiman, a silent, hidden observer at his own son's execution. Before Mustafa could process this unnerving emptiness, they emerged from the shadows. 7 figures. They were large, powerfully built men, but their faces were impassive, their eyes devoid of emotion. These were the Dilsiz Chelatla, the deaf-mute executioners of the palace. They were the Sultan's most trusted and terrifying servants, men who could not hear pleas for mercy, could not speak of the horrors they committed, and whose loyalty was absolute. They did not carry blades. To spill the sacred blood of an Ottoman prince was taboo. Instead, one of them held the instrument of royal death, a simple, elegant, and brutally effective silk bowstring. There was no accusation, no trial, no final words exchanged between father and son. There was only the sudden, violent rush of bodies. The mutes lunged. Mustafa, caught by surprise but a warrior to his core, reacted with ferocious strength. He was one of the most formidable fighters in the empire, and he fought for his life with the desperation of a cornered lion. He threw off his first attackers, his powerful fists breaking bones. For a terrifying moment, it seemed he might prevail. The struggle was a grotesque ballet of silent, deadly force. There were no war cries, only the sickening thud of flesh against flesh, the grunting of exertion, and the frantic, rasping breaths of a prince fighting against the inexorable, silent tide of his father's will. The fight was primal, a desperate explosion of a life refusing to be extinguished. For long, agonizing moments, Mustafa's martial prowess kept the executioners at bay. He was stronger than any one of them, perhaps stronger than any 3, but he was not stronger than all 7. The sheer weight of numbers began to tell. One mute seized his legs, another his arms. His furious struggle became a frantic thrashing. He was borne to the ground, pinned beneath a mountain of silent, determined muscle. The silk bowstring, a thing of beauty turned into an instrument of horror, was finally looped around his neck. As the cord tightened, the world dissolved into a crushing, suffocating darkness. His powerful lungs burned for air that would not come. In his final, terrifying moments of consciousness, his eyes, wide with betrayal and agony, fixed upon the screen that concealed his father. Did he see a flicker of movement? A silhouette of the man who gave him life and was now so cruelly taking it away? We will never know. The struggle ceased. The vibrant, charismatic prince, the hope of the Janissaries and the future of the empire, lay still on the rich Persian carpet. The mute stepped back. The shadow behind the screen solidified into the form of the Sultan. Suleiman the Magnificent, the lawgiver, the ruler of the world, stepped forward to gaze upon his handiwork. He looked down at the lifeless body of his firstborn son, the image of his own vigorous youth. An attendant, following a rehearsed instruction, placed the forged letter, the supposed proof of treason, upon Mustafa's chest. Suleiman stared for a long time, his face an unreadable mask of stone. It was not the look of a triumphant king securing his throne, but of a father who had just sacrificed a part of his own soul to the cold, unforgiving god of power. The judgment was complete. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any before it. The body of Şehzade Mustafa was carried out of the white tent and displayed for the army to see. The intent was to present undeniable proof of the traitor's punishment, to quell any dissent with a show of absolute authority. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The sight of their beloved prince, a man they viewed as the epitome of Ottoman virtue, lying dead on a common prayer rug, did not inspire fear. It ignited a firestorm of grief and rage. A low murmur rippled through the ranks, swelling into a roar of disbelief, then into a collective cry of fury that shook the very foundations of the camp. This was not justice, this was murder. This was the work of the palace cabal, of the manipulative Hurrem Sultan and her detested puppet, Rustam Pasha. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Sultan, the very men who formed the bedrock of his power, turned on him. They drew their swords, not against the Safavids, but towards the imperial tent. They beat their shields and shouted Mustafa's name, their grief curdling into a thirst for vengeance. They demanded the head of the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, the man they held directly responsible. The camp teetered on the brink of open mutiny, a civil war right on the enemy's doorstep. Suleiman, for the first time in his long reign, was faced with the raw, untamable fury of his own army. His authority, once absolute, was cracking. He had killed his son to prevent a rebellion, but in doing so, he had very nearly caused one. Forced to choose between his throne and his son-in-law, the choice was simple. To appease the enraged soldiers, he stripped Rustam Pasha of his titles and sent him away in disgrace. It was a humiliating concession, a desperate move to quell the flames. The rage subsided, but the trust was broken forever. The execution of Mustafa had not secured the empire. It had left a deep, bleeding wound on its soul. The deed was done. The silken bowstring had done its silent, brutal work. But as the lifeless body of Şehzade Mustafa was carried from the Sultan's tent, the silence was shattered. A roar of disbelief, then of pure, unadulterated rage, erupted from the heart of the Ottoman army. The Janissaries, who saw in Mustafa the reincarnation of their greatest sultans, the very embodiment of their martial pride, were inconsolable. They did not see the execution of a traitor. They saw the murder of their future, the assassination of their hope. Their loyalty, forged in 100 battles, was to the House of Osman, but their love was for Mustafa. Now, that love had curdled into fury. They stormed the tent of the Grand Vizier, Rustam Pasha, the man they universally blamed as the architect of this conspiracy. They tore it to shreds, searching for the man they called the Devil's Vizier, who had wisely already fled. Suleiman, the shadow of God on earth, the lawgiver, for the first time in his long reign, faced the genuine threat of a full-scale mutiny. The pillars of his power trembled. He was forced to act, not as a grieving father or a triumphant sovereign, but as a pragmatic politician scrambling to regain control. To placate the seething army, he stripped Rustam Pasha of his titles and his seal of office, banishing him from the camp. It was a public sacrifice, a concession to the soldiers' fury, but everyone knew it was a temporary measure. For Hurrem Sultan, watching from afar in the capital, this was a victory, but one that tasted of ash. She had eliminated her greatest rival, securing the path to the throne for one of her own sons. Yet, the cost was immense. She had pushed her husband to kill his own beloved child, and, in doing so, had shaken the very foundations of his authority. The empire was safe from Mustafa's supposed treason, but it was now wounded, resentful, and suspicious of its own master. In the lonely expanse of the imperial tent, the mask of the unassailable Sultan finally fell. The lawgiver, the conqueror of Rhodes and Belgrade, the man who made European monarchs tremble, was now just a father who had commanded the death of his firstborn son. The silence that followed the army's rage was, for Suleiman, 1,000 times more deafening. Reports from courtiers speak of a man utterly broken. He refused food, he shunned company, and he spent days staring at the spot where his son had breathed his last. The weight of what he had done pressed down upon him with the force of a collapsing dynasty. Did he truly believe the whispers of treason? Or, in the quiet of his soul, did he now see the web of deceit woven by Hurrem and Rustam? We know that after the execution, he commanded Mustafa's private coffers to be brought to him. Inside, instead of evidence of conspiracy or correspondence with the Shah of Persia, he found letters. Letter after letter from Mustafa, professing his undying love, his loyalty, his innocence. He found poems written in his son's hand, praising his father's glory. Each word was a dagger to his heart. This was not the correspondence of a traitor. It was the testament of a devoted son. The grief that followed was a private, all-consuming hell. Suleiman, a gifted poet himself under the pen name Muhibi, turned to verse to express a sorrow too profound for prose. His poems from this period are filled with themes of loss, betrayal, and a deep, gnawing regret. He had sacrificed his son on the altar of the state, convinced it was necessary to prevent civil war. But as he sat alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his own making, he was forced to confront the terrible possibility that he had not saved the empire, but had merely murdered his child, and with him, a part of his own soul. The execution of Mustafa sent shockwaves through the empire, but for one person, it was not a political tremor, but an existential earthquake. Şehzade Cihangir, Suleiman's youngest son, was a prince unlike any other. Born with a severe spinal deformity, a hunchback that caused him constant pain, he could never dream of wielding a sword or leading an army. His strength was in his mind and his heart. He was brilliant, poetic, and possessed a gentle soul that was universally admired. Above all, he adored his older half-brother, Mustafa. For Cihangir, Mustafa was not a rival, but a protector, a role model, and his closest confidant. Mustafa, in turn, treated the frail prince with a tenderness and respect that transcended the brutal politics of the court. He saw past the deformity to the beautiful mind within. Cihangir had accompanied his father on the Persian campaign and was present in the camp when the execution took place. The news of his beloved brother's death, killed by the order of their own father, shattered him completely. The psychological shock was too much for his fragile body to bear. He fell into a deep, inconsolable depression, refusing to eat or speak. His physical ailments, always present, worsened dramatically under the strain of his grief. He saw the world for what it was, a place where love and loyalty were meaningless before the cold calculus of power. Just a few weeks after Mustafa's death, Cihangir also succumbed. He died, the court physician said, of a broken heart. For Suleiman, this was a second, devastating blow. He had lost another son, not to a silken cord, but to the fallout of his own terrible decision. Cihangir's death was a tragic testament to the poison that had seeped into the heart of the imperial family, a curse of the throne that consumed even the most innocent. The death of a single prince, no matter how beloved, may seem like a footnote in the grand saga of a 600-year empire. But the execution of Şehzade Mustafa was no footnote. It was a turning point, a moment of profound and lasting consequence. With Mustafa gone, the path to the throne was now open exclusively to the sons of Hürrem Sultan. The very civil war Suleiman had sought to prevent by killing his firstborn became an inevitability. His two remaining sons, the drunken and indolent Selim and the fiery and ambitious Bayezid, were soon locked in a bitter, bloody struggle for succession. Suleiman was forced to choose between them, ultimately backing Selim and sanctioning the execution of his other son, Bayezid, along with Bayezid's own young sons. The Sultan who had wept for Mustafa now oversaw the extermination of another branch of his family tree. When Suleiman finally died on campaign in 1566, the man who inherited the throne was Selim II. History remembers him not as the Magnificent or the Lawgiver, but as Selim the Sot. He was a pale shadow of his father, and an even paler shadow of the man Mustafa was reputed to be. While Mustafa was a proven military commander and a skilled administrator beloved by the army and the people, Selim preferred the pleasures of the harem to the duties of the state. Many historians argue that this was the moment the long, slow decline of the Ottoman Empire truly began. The tradition of sending princes to govern provinces, which had produced capable rulers like Mustafa, was curtailed. Future sultans would be raised in the gilded cage of the palace, inexperienced and ill-equipped to rule. The execution of Mustafa was more than a family tragedy. It was an act that may have robbed the empire of its most capable future leader, setting it on a course from which it would never fully recover. One death, one fateful decision, had altered the destiny of millions.